I'll be glad to be here the next couple of weeks to talk about forgiveness. I think it's really central to our faith, but it's also a critical aspect of good relationships. And I really believe that whenever I speak to a group about forgiveness, that a good percentage, if not all of us, have someone in our life that we either need to forgive or be forgiven by. Because we don't live in a state of perfect relationships, and that was hit home to me this morning when Julie came in, and I realized it's been quite a while since I've gotten my teeth checked and cleaned, and so I'm in need of forgiveness from her, and I'm hoping to head off the getting yelled at the next time I go, but I don't know if it's going to work or not.
I just give a silent
Right. There's a story in Guidepost a few years ago that I really liked. It was written by a nurse, and she worked in the ICU, and there was a man there who had had a heart attack, and he was recovering nicely from the heart attack, but she noticed that he was really depressed. And so she began talking to him and found that his only living family member, close family member, was his daughter. And 2 or 3 years before, an adult daughter, 2 or 3 years before, they had had a big fight, I think a blow up over the man that she was seeing. And they had not spoken since. So that, at the point they had the heart attack, there had been 2 or 3 or 4 years of silence and no contact. And as he was lying there in his bed, having faced the possibility of dying, all of a sudden things began to look differently to him, and it seemed stupid to have an argument like that separate him from the only relative that he had, the daughter that he loved. When the nurse heard this, she got the okay. She called the daughter, who lived in a town a few hours away, and when the daughter found out that her father had a heart attack, was in the ICU, she had a similar reaction, that now the argument that had separated them for several years seemed inconsequential, and in the face of her father's possible death, she was now scared about losing him, and so she got into the car and began driving toward to the hospital. But before she arrived, her father had a second, more serious heart attack, and he died. And so he was dead when she arrived at the hospital. But he left her a note, and it's a brief note, and in the note he told her that he loved her and forgave her and hoped that she would forgive him. And so the daughter found a measure of peace even after the death of her father. But the point is that so many times the things that separate us, the hurts that we get, the fights that we have with other people, it seems worth it at the time to lose that relationship or to alienate ourselves from that person. But in the face of dying, both realized that what they had fought about wasn't worth ruining their relationship over. And that's really at the heart of forgiveness. Is can we repair relationships, because is the relationship worth losing? In this first week, we're going to talk some about the biblical ideas about forgiveness, and then next week we're going to talk about some of the things that people have to overcome and do to be able to forgive well. Dick likes to say if there was only one story from the Bible, he thinks it should be the story of the prodigal son. And in the story is the heart of forgiveness, where the son wastes the father's fortune and then comes back. Says he comes to his senses and he comes back, and to the surprise of his listeners, and sometimes to the anger of listeners now, the son's forgiven and restored as a son. But again, forgiveness gets at the heart of relationships. The father could have accepted the son's bargain, which is, can I come and be a servant? Can I work for you? But to stay angry or to not forgive the son meant losing that relationship, and the father in the story chose, he wanted a son more than he wanted whatever he was entitled to, quote, and getting back at the son for what he had done. Whenever you have questions or comments, just raise your hand, and I'm happy to stop at any point. This morning I want to start, though, with a definition. We need a definition of forgiveness. What is it? And forgiveness, the definition I use is the forgiveness is the giving up the perceived right to get even, and the sending away of feelings of hurt and anger and bitterness. Now the first part's kind of a behavioral thing, and it says it's giving up the perceived right to get even. And I want to highlight the word perceived for a second, because the definition of forgiveness does not acknowledge that getting even is actually a right. We feel like it is. If we've been hurt, we feel like we have the right to hurt back or to do something damaging back. But the definition says that that's a perceived right, that we actually don't have that right for vengeance or to, quote, get even. So it's blocking all those behaviors that would come out really naturally to lash back at another person or hurt them.
That brings up when we talk about that, people keep hollering they want justice. We have to have justice. Their relative was killed or something, murdered. Right. We have to have justice. Aren't they really saying we want vengeance? A lot of times they are, and I think, you know, in the end, I think you discover that it's unsatisfying. I once worked with a man after a very serious suicide attempt, and his only son had been killed by a drunk driver shortly after he graduated from high school. And he spent the next year making sure that the drunk driver went to prison, which he did. The suicide attempt came after that, because I believe he discovered, and the driver should have gone to prison. I'm not arguing if something should happen to the driver, but he expected that to feel better after that. And what he discovered was that he didn't. His son was still gone, and whatever term, even if the drunk driver had been given the gas chamber or something, he would have discovered the same thing, that it didn't make up for the loss of his son. So yeah, I think justice and vengeance often get confused, and a lot of our justice system is kind of based on that, that we'll be satisfied. I remember reading, I like the Mysteries by Tony Hillerman, who writes about the Navajo and some of their practices, and one story was about justice, and it didn't make any sense to the Navajo to send people to prison. And it shows how ingrained your ideas of justice are, because I couldn't wrap my mind around a different way, a really different way of looking at what they perceived as justice. But I think we confuse those things a lot and find out that it isn't that satisfying. It doesn't take away the injury, really, and that's why the getting even is kind of a false concept too, because I'm not sure we ever feel like we get even. You know, somebody really hurts our feelings, we hurt them back. Do we say, okay, we're all square now, I don't have any more feelings about it? And I don't think we usually do. I think we're still mad and hurt. They might be mad and hurt now too, but I'm not sure we end up feeling satisfied about that.
That starts a cycle where it's back and forth, back and forth.
Right, and when we get into a little bit about what Jesus said, stopping that cycle of vengeance was actually something that he was very concerned about. And again, nobody looks at things exactly the same way. When they've done studies of couples, they've come to the conclusion that 9 out of 10 times when we hurt or frustrate our spouse, it was not our intention to do that. So let's say I do something and my wife's upset about that, and she calls me a name or something. She might see the score as 1-1, but I see it as 1 unintentional to 1 intentional. You know, so I call her name back. Now we're even in my mind. But no, I've done 2 things, and so she does something, and so I'm not sure we ever have the same scorecard about that either. One of the things I want to emphasize about forgiveness is that Forgiveness is the way of recovering from big hurts. So it has to do with injuries that we inflict on other people. It doesn't have to do with personality differences. There's a personality difference or something that, or behavior that your spouse does that drives you nuts. They don't need to be forgiven for that. You have to learn to accept it or find a way to live with it, but they don't have to be forgiven for who they are.
Is forgiveness by definition something you learn, or is it be part of your character, not have to learn it? Is it something that we learn? It's cultural or universal?
I think some people are more forgiving than others, but I think it's something that we learn, hopefully right from the beginning. I mean, as soon as we're able to walk, we're starting to do things that can cause damage. You know, and if we do something big, you know, like break something that was really precious to one of our parents or something, hopefully we experience forgiveness, that we get back to being loved as much as we were before after doing that. So I think it's something hopefully we learn early on, or we don't learn.
You learn it because somebody forgives you. That's how you learn it?
That's what I think, yeah. You have the experience of being forgiven. Or not. I mean, you also have the experience of people staying mad at you forever, or you're really not sure that you've been restored as a full, that you're loved as much as the other children in the family or something, if you really messed up badly. So I think it is a learned behavior, but we can learn it early on, because even between kids, you know, by the time they're playing together, they're going to have some hurt feelings and things, and have to figure out how to work those things out. So forgiveness has to do with how does a relationship recover when there's been a hurt that you can't really undo. I can't give you breakfast in bed for a year and we're square. Your feelings are still hurt. I like to use the example of if I hit a baseball through your window and I came and told you that I did it, and I paid for a new window, if you're still mad about it, that's really kind of your problem. In my mind, we've been square. You know, you have a nice new window. I acknowledge it. But if the baseball hit an heirloom, the only memory of your grandparent, or something, I can pay for the window, but I can't do anything about the heirloom. So if we're going to be okay again, if our friendship or neighborly relationship's going to go back to the way it was, you're going to have to decide whether you're going to forgive me or not for that. Because I can be apologetic. I could try to find a new one, but it wouldn't be the same. You know, so are we ever going to be square again, or is this thing going to stand between us? And it can stand between us like the father and daughter, where they don't speak to one another, or it can stand between us as sort of this invisible wall. I mean, I would guess that when most families get together, there's if it's a pretty big gathering, there's at least a few people that are pretending to be nice to the other family members, but they're really quite ticked at them because there's some sort of falling out or wound that hasn't been healed. So we can alienate or we can be distant. There's lots of different ways to handle it. But if we want the relationship repaired, forgiveness is a thing that heals that, and I think that's the purpose of it. So the first goal of forgiveness is reconciliation. It's hopefully that the hurt parties repair their relationship and put this experience behind them. The second goal is to have a kind of inner peace, because I don't think because I think a lack of forgiveness eats a person inside, and it comes out in some sort of behavior like not trusting other people, or getting angry easily at other people, or there's something that it does to us too. Leslie Casper likes to use the expression that a lack of forgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And that's a perfect phrase, because when I work with clients and it's time for forgiveness, there's certain barriers, and we'll talk more about those next week. But one of the barriers I get the most is people say, I feel like it's letting the person off the hook. And in a way it is, But sometimes they're talking about somebody that's dead, or a teacher they had 30 years ago or something, and it's like, well, what are you doing to them? What hook is the dead person on? What is it that you're holding on to this anger and bitterness actually does? Okay, so I wanted to talk about some of the biblical ideas about forgiveness. First, the Bible uses several words for the concept of forgiveness. So when you see the word, in English they'll just translate as forgive, but there's actually several biblical words. And the most common one means to send away. To send away those kind of feelings of anger and bitterness, to send away from the relationship, the thing that separated people. And it's a really ancient word. Its roots are in ancient religious practice where a town would celebrate New Year's by chasing a goat through the town. And it must have been kind of a interesting sight to see a few people with sticks and things, and they'd chase the goat through the town, make sure it passed all the houses and up and down all the streets. And when it passed everything, gone through the whole town, they drove it out to the wilderness, and they wouldn't let it come back. And what they believed was happening was that the goat was taking all the sins of the people for the year on its back, and when they sent it away, everybody was getting a fresh slate. You got to start the year with a kind of a clean slate, and it's that ancient religious ceremony is where we get our word scapegoat from. When we see somebody as a scapegoat, they're kind of bearing the fault for something. And so the idea was to send away. We've got to send away these feelings of anger and hurt and bitterness if we're going to repair the relationship and or be healthy inside. The second most common phrase that translates as forgiveness is to lift away. And the idea here is that it's kind of taken away from us. And I actually think they're kind of two sides of the same coin, and it's kind of neat that they use the two phrases, because to send away is an active phrase. So I'm going to muster whatever inner resources I have, whatever spiritual resources I have, I'm going to send away those feelings. Lift away is a more passive image, that somebody's going to take it away from me. And I like that because my experience is, and personally, and also experience of working with people is that there's times when we'd like to, where we said, I'd really like to stop being angry, I'd really like to stop being bitter about that, but I just can't seem to do it. And I'm working at it, but I just can't seem to do it. And it makes me think that a long time ago, they had a Franciscan monk come here for they were having programs in the evening. I can't remember whether it was Sunday evening or Wednesday evening program, but the monk talked about there were two brothers in the order that had hurt him terribly, and so he was very angry with them. And but he got to the point where he decided he didn't want to be angry with them anymore, and but he couldn't get rid of it. And of course he saw them every day, so that would kind of push those buttons. So he decided that 2 or 3 times a day he would pray the prayer of St. Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace, etc. And so he started doing that, and he realized a few months later that the anger and the hurt and the bitterness had gone. He couldn't pinpoint a date. He hadn't thought about it for a while, but he realized that it had been taken away from him. And I've had similar experiences where you want to I want to stop worrying, or I want to stop being angry and things, but I'm having a hard time doing it, and kind of taking it to prayer, and also having other people pray for me, that sometime later I'll realize, Jesus, it's gone. I'm not doing that anymore, or those feelings are gone. But again, I couldn't pinpoint when they left. So I really like the balance of us working at it to send those away, but also it's kind of like the first step of the 12-step program, where you have to admit that you're powerless over what you're addicted to. I think there's also a time where we feel powerless to get rid of these feelings of anger and hurt and bitterness, and need help in doing that. let me stop for a second and see what questions or comments you have. Mike?
I think that's really important. I mean, this is helpful to me to hear about that, about the fact that you sometimes just need to have it lifted. And yet, you spoke about the person who had prayed this prayer every day. So they had done something
Right.
to try to open themselves to that grace which finally came. And I was hoping you could say a little more about that, for the person who finds it really hard to let go and they can't make an act of forgiveness, more about what they can do to facilitate that opening.
Well, and we'll go kind of next week into more detail about the forgiveness process. But I think it kind of begins with a decision that I really want to do this, and first making the efforts to send the things away. But there's a phrase about let go and let God, and that sounds easy, but it's actually quite hard. And I use the example of the 12-step program, and in the middle steps, it asks you to make an inventory of the different ways that you hurt people and those kinds of things, and also what they call character defects, the part of yourselves that need to change. And then the next step is praying, giving those to God and asking God to change those things that need to be changed about myself. And when people talk about that step, one of the things they talk about is that they've identified this as a problem. They want to be rid of it in a way. But as they see God starting to take that away, they also have the experience of holding on to it with both fists. And so I think often it's kind of a gradual process but sometimes those fingers have to be kind of pried open. That it's such a paradox to say I want to be rid of something and then hold on to it with both hands. But I see it all the time. I'll see a spouse be yelling for years about wanting their spouse to change, and then when the spouse starts to change, they say, "Well, geez, I've been mad at him so long. I'm not sure I even care." They finally got what they want, and they pull back. So I think it's a kind of gradual process of letting the hands open, and I think that's really one place where one's spiritual resources really become key, because there's a lot of trust. I think the reason we hold on is that it's a big trust issue, and we become very vulnerable when we do those things, and because that anger and stuff sort of becomes a friend in some sort of bizarre way. In the worst case scenario, it's actually a person's identity. It's part of their identity, as they are an angry person, and it's hard to shake those things.
Do you have to have active participation on the part of the person you're forgiving or the incident you're forgiving? The other person that you're trying to forgive doesn't accept it and repeats the same thing?
Yeah.
What happens in that?
Well, that's a nice segue into the next things I want to talk about, but that's a really critical question. And reconciliation is a two-person thing or a three-person thing, whatever's involved, and you can't reconcile with both people participating. And so we'll talk about what to do in that instance. I want to talk about a couple Bible passages I see as really key, and the second one will address what you're talking about. The first one comes from the Sermon on the Mount, and that's really tough stuff. I don't know if you tried to study the Sermon on the Mount, but it's some pretty challenging things there. And this first passage is about anger, and I want to talk a little bit about it because anger usually goes hand in hand in forgiveness situations. Some people, a minority of people, aren't particularly angry, and that it goes straight to the hurt. But most people are both hurt and angry when it's been a really painful situation. And in the time that I grew up, and especially the type of family background I have is anger. Anger was a really, really negative emotion that people weren't supposed to have. My family message would be that anger is a bad thing. It hurts people, which is true. But it's also the thing that straightens things out, you know. And so if you got strong messages about anger being a bad thing, you have to keep it underground. You know, if you are angry, keep it to yourself and don't ruin anybody else's day.
Let it gnaw at you instead.
Right. The sad part of that is it's hard to straighten anything out, you know, if that's the message. So kind of having a good understanding of anger is a starting place in the forgiveness process, I think. And Jesus here, what he does in parts of the Sermon on the Mount is kind of take a commandment and talk about it, but he usually kind of radicalizes it. He makes it even stronger than the commandment itself. And so he says, you have heard it that it was said from those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister, you are liable to judgment. And anyone who calls your brother or sister, you airhead, it literally means empty-headed, but I colloquialized it a little bit, is liable to the council. And anyone who says you fool is in the danger of the hell of fire. So like good German families like the one I grew up in, this is our Bible passage. See, anger is a really bad thing. You know, just being angry, you're liable to judgment, which Jesus is talking about kind of a justice of the peace type thing. And if you call somebody empty-headed, you might go before the Sanhedrin. I mean, it's kind of a, you know, going down the Hammond district court or whatever because you got angry and called somebody an airhead. And if you call them a fool, you're kind of in big time, you know, kind of permanent, the potential of permanent trouble. So it seems to be saying that anger across the board is a bad thing. But it really isn't. And there are a couple of keys to understanding that. The first is English is a very emotion-poor language. We use one word like love to cover the whole experience, or anger to cover the whole experience, as if there aren't different types of these feelings. But the biblical languages usually have several words for a feeling like anger, and they're not synonyms. They don't mean the same thing. They're not used interchangeably. And the word here for anger that Jesus uses here is a very specific type of anger that we nurture. The Bible didn't see like a quick flash of anger as such a bad thing, but there's an anger that we kind of nurture. It's in it, and we feel like we've been wronged and things, and so we kind of feed it like a fire. And the image behind this word goes back to nomadic society. One of the keys as you move from place to place is you had to keep a coal or whatever they used burning, because you had to be able to start a fire wherever you went. So there was somebody actually in charge of that. They had to make sure, you know, and how you do that, you kind of blow on it, you know, and you check, you know, and you make sure that it stays hot so that wherever you stop, you can start a fire. So it's critical to your survival. And we can do that with anger. We blow on it, we feed it, we find people who we know will take our side without knowing anything about the other side of the story. So now you got 15 people mad at the person you're mad at, and you know they're telling you what you want to hear, that you're completely in the right, they're completely in the wrong. So there's lots and lots of things that we can do that really nurses that anger, and as it gets hotter, then it's going to express itself in lashing out at somebody, either behaviorally or verbally. And that's that getting even process. When we do that, we think, okay, well now we're even in the score. Now Jesus compares it to murder, and of course, exaggeration is one of the things they used. I mean, nobody's going to go to court. Nobody's going to go before the Sanhedrin because they called somebody an airhead. But the point of it is that we don't go to somebody and say, you know, I was really frustrated when you did such and such. We don't focus on the behavior. We usually attack them, and so we go straight for character assassination. You know, we don't, somebody didn't just forget to do something, they don't care. And in fact, they never cared. You know, and that's what people react to. What do you mean I never cared? Like 36 years I didn't care once? I mean, it seems, why'd we get married then? You know, if I didn't care once. So that kind of nursing anger is going to find the expression in hurting somebody. And for us, the word "you fool" is, you know, a fool is kind of a silly person in our culture, but the biblical word actually is for somebody that's totally corrupt, morally corrupt. So in essence, there's nothing human about them, and so they're just a terrible person. So it's very strong language, and I like on the shelf there is Lewis Mead's "Forgive and Forget," and he has stages of forgiveness, and one of his stages is you let the person back into the human race, and and I really like that because for a while they aren't there. And, you know, if you're really angry at them, they're kind of totally in the wrong, they're totally worthless and things. So how you express the key, I guess I want to say, is that anger was created for a purpose. The purpose for anger is it's what we call a secondary emotion. It's a reaction to something. It's a reaction to either being terribly hurt or injustice. And so anger is meant to activate a person that says, wait a second, you can't hurt me like that, or this situation's not fair. And if it's used properly, it can play a really strong role. I like to think back to the way drunk drivers were looked upon when I was a kid, and even into the 80s, because I'm thinking of the movie Arthur, which was maybe made in the late 70s, early 80s, something. But drunk drivers, it often was a comedy scene. You know, the person driving home, and they, you know, they get one wheel off the cliff, and they're going back and forth, and that kind of thing. And nothing happened to drunk drivers in those days. It was a radical thing when they even began putting them in jail for a night. You know, to say, wait a second, this is a really dangerous thing. And then the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD, you know, got organized to say, you know, I guess all the mothers who had lost children, to say, we got to do something about this. This is a terrible menace. And so they really corrected an injustice, and the last 10 years have begun to take it much more seriously. And I think about the messages my kids grew up with early on from different school events that you know, driving while impaired is a really bad thing. I never got that message, and like a lot of people, got behind the wheel of a car when I was younger when I should not have, or got in the car with somebody else that should not have been. My senior prom, I still think what a miracle to have survived that thing. So there's a role for anger, but it's to motivate, to respond to the hurt or respond to an injustice. But how are you going to handle that? And here it is really clear that the getting even aspect is not what anger is for. And somebody mentioned, you did, Julie, about the vengeance cycle goes on and on and on, and it does. I mean, just really speaking, the people that have been fighting for at least 2,000 years before he came and are still fighting 2,000 years later. I think sometimes of a book I had to read in high school was Huckleberry Finn, and you know that book started out as a sequel to Tom Sawyer, which was kind of a fun book, but it became very serious social commentary. And as he's traveling down the river, he stops and spends some time with the family, and you get to like the family. Well, the family's in a feud with another family, and they get wiped out while Huckleberry Finn's there. And I remember the sick feeling of a family being, you know, made extinct. That it had gone back and forth so many times that the only way it ended was when one entire family was wiped out. And what a sickening thing that is. And we don't do it to that degree, but in small ways we do that often to keep something going. And there is, and in essence, Jesus kind of saying, it's got to stop somewhere. somewhere that cycle of vengeance has to stop, or it is going to just keep going on and on. And to make that clear, the next verse says, so if you are offering your gift at the altar and remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar without giving it and go and first be reconciled to your brother and sister and then come and offer your gift. And so in this instance, Jesus is calling the offender. If there's somebody that you've hurt or you know is angry with you, it's kind of a call to go and try to be reconciled, try to work it out with that person. And clearly that's going to involve some anger, because part of the forgiveness process is being willing to listen to the pain of that's the step that everybody wants to skip. I want to say I'm sorry, I want you to forgive me, but let's leave out the details, of how it hurt you. And it's not like you need to hear that for the rest of your life, but there has to be some willingness to understand how profoundly hurt the person was by what we did. And that's why it's so very hard to do it. Again, using the 12-step model, there's a time where you need to go and make amends with the people that you've hurt. And a guy named Keith Miller wrote a book called Hunger for Healing, where he uses the 12 steps as a way of growing spiritually. You don't have to have an addiction to work through them. And he has a tape series that goes along with it. And when the people are talking about this step of going back to face-to-face to work things out with the people they hurt, I could feel my stomach tightening, because, again, I don't believe that there's probably anybody that isn't in need of working something out with somebody. And I began thinking, geez, how hard that would be. I started thinking maybe some people I should go talk to, and the knot got stronger of how much courage it goes to take and say, I know I really hurt you, and I want to do something about that, or is there something I can do about it? It takes an incredible amount of courage to do that. So let me stop before I go on to the next passage and see what questions or comments that you have.
Mine is the same as probably what he was talking about. If somebody's doing something deliberately to you, and you say, no, forgive them not. But they keep doing it again, well, how? They're not sorry for what they're doing, and so how do you handle that?
Well, and what the next passage will talk about is that there's, if the other person isn't open to reconciliation, and like I said, next week we'll go into how forgiveness actually works in depth. And one of the ways that it works is that the offender has to make a commitment to control that behavior in the future. And so you use examples where there is no commitment to contain the behavior. And forgiveness takes on a different form. There's still a need for forgiveness, but reconciliation no longer becomes the goal unless the person is really willing to make that change. You see that in abuse patterns or where people abuse substances. They're sorry after the event's over. Though I think a lot of times it's a different type of sorry. There's a type of sorry where I'm really feeling terrible about hurting you, and there's a type of sorry that's really saying, I'm afraid you might leave me because of what I did. So I'm sorry to try to repair that because I don't want you to go. So it's kind of a self-serving sorry, and that's what happens a lot of those instances. Is the person might be sorry after the terrible event, and may try for a while, maybe 6 months before the next terrible event.
Do the same thing over again.
Right.
So what do you do?
Well, what the next passage will talk about is that there's a time of saying I've got to separate myself from a person. I have to keep them from a distance. I can't be in a relationship with that person. There's still a role for forgiveness, like I said, and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But there is that place that I can't continue to be vulnerable to this abuse that I'm receiving, and so I've got to keep that person at a distance I can't be in a relationship with that person unless that changes. I remember flipping through the stations one time, and on C-SPAN was a editor of a magazine. I can't remember her name or the name of the magazine, but she was talking about her ex-husband who had been abusive, and she said so she needed to get away from him, but she also talked about it's one thing to separate from somebody, the other is how you're going to feel about it, feel about that person. Are you going to continue to feel anger and bitterness and hurt, etc. is a different question, and that's what we'll talk about in a second. But she talked about it. I can still love him, still wish for the best for him, but it's going to have to be from over here. It's not going to be having dinner or whatever. I'm going to have to keep it at arm's length. So let me, if there isn't another question, let me go on to the next passage, because they're a really nice balance, and it starts to address the question that you're talking about. This also comes from Matthew, the 18th chapter. And it says, if your brother or sister sins against you, go and tell them their fault between you and them alone. And if they listen to you, you have gained your brother or sister. So in the previous passage, it says if you're the offender, if you've hurt somebody, go and try to straighten it out. This time it says if you're the one that's been hurt, go and try to straighten it out. So forgiveness is seen as so important that it doesn't matter which end you're on. Jesus is calling the person to go and try, whether you're the hurt party or the injurer. And probably one thing I should say is, as we talk about this, most of the time we talk in instances where somebody's clearly wrong and somebody's clearly the hurt person. Life's not that simple, and all the time. Sometimes it is, but I would say 80% of the cases are in the middle, where both people are hurt and both people have injured the other, and there's kind of a need for mutual forgiveness. I think is a much more common instance than when we're totally in the right and they're totally in the wrong, or and vice versa. Though that exists, definitely, but it's murkier. And I think, like I said, most of the time, both people have done something that contributed to the hurt.
You could find a lot of case histories in the news this past week where the judge dismissed the case against these 3 operators of the nightclub where 21 people were trampled to death. I'm sure there are 21 families with all different ideas, and they're all unhappy right now.
Right.
And some of them said we didn't get justice.
Right.
What they really meant was we didn't get our revenge.
Yeah. Right. That's the case sometimes. There's other times I feel like if people really are liable. I mean, we live in a very fault I don't know if the accidents still exist in our culture. I still remember the 60 Minutes from the 1970s where a guy put his ladder in cow manure or something and fell and successfully sued the ladder company because he didn't get warned, I guess, that he shouldn't put in manure. But it's like mind-boggling. But there's kind of the fault thing, and then there's times when I think imprisonment is really about protecting society. There's a time that if a person really is culpable, that justice takes the form of saying, well, we've got to separate you from people because we can't have you keep doing the harm, whether it's drunk driving or molesting children or killing somebody or whatever. It's not, to me, it's not always about vengeance. And so if these nightclub owners were truly culpable in some fashion, it's a shame that they got off because they weren't held accountable for their irresponsible behavior. On the other hand, like I said, I sometimes feel like there is no accidents in our culture, and we try to find somebody to blame for anything that happens, and I'm not sure that that's kind of accurate. I mean, some things just are accidents, or in the case of the guy at the ladder, I consider that stupidity. I mean, and I've been stupid plenty of times too, but if I fell off a ladder and hadn't done that, I don't think I'd find somebody else to blame. I think I'd be sitting there telling myself how stupid I am. and everybody else would be too. No.
Mark, help me remember, are those two teachings of Jesus, one right after the other?
No, one's in chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, and the other's in chapter 18, comes later. Okay, so it goes on to say, but if the offender doesn't listen, take one or two others along with you, that every word might be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. And if he or she refuses to listen to them, then tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a person be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. And so there's a 3-step process here of the 3 attempts to approach the offender to reconcile the relationship. The 3rd step seems kind of ridiculous to us. I guess it'd be hard to have somebody go before 800 people here at Westminster and deal with this, but we're talking about smaller house churches, and actually there are some churches, some denominations in the area that take this kind of thing more seriously, which I think sometimes is a bad thing, but a lot of times a really good thing, that there's because usually along with it goes a willingness to help the person through the situation, but they take this need to confront somebody that's being harmful more seriously, and I see a lot of churches hurt by the fact that every church I know has some harmful members, or sometimes some harmful staff, and I don't see that addressed very much. I think they just sort of allowed to go on being harmful, So what's this saying? I mean, it has a really strong ending. We're saying you have to remove this person. If you do these 3 steps, and I don't know the 3 steps are literal, but if you made several attempts at reconciliation, you have to remove this person from the community. And that it can seem harsh in a way, but the fact is, if you have an unrepentant, harmful person, it does tremendous damage within relationships, within a family, within a organization like the church, in a work setting. You know, a lot of times in a work setting, there's a harmful person. You know, and it's hard to contain that person. They do a lot of damage. Before I came here, I worked at a place called Presbyterian Children's Village, and we had units of 8 to 10 kids in them. And part of our treatment model was we wanted the kids to help each other to get better, you know, and to work together and things. But if you had somebody in the unit that was stealing, trust level went way down. If you had somebody that shared what people had said in the confidential meetings with other kids, you saw the trust level go way down. So if you have an unrepentant, harmful person loose in whatever group you're in, they're going to do a lot of damage. And you know, this is a church that's trying to live by a different standard. Say that we're going to be kinder to one another, we're going to be closer to one another, we're going to help one another, try to live by the things that Jesus outlines. And again, if you have someone who's harmful and not taking responsibility for it, you're constantly vulnerable to the damage that they're going to do to the individual or the community. That really hit home to me in a movie called The Green Mile. I don't know if you saw it. It's a movie about death row back in the 1930s. And there's guards, and then there's the guys waiting to be executed. And on both sides, most of the characters are decent people. The guards are trying to be decent people. Most of the guys on death row have made a mistake, but they're essentially a decent person. On both sides, there's one guard and one man on death row who are not decent people. And what hit home to me, I guess I always knew it, but I never felt it so strongly, is that if you're a person that lives by some sort of rules, there's lines that you won't cross. Even within your rules, you might hurt people and things, but there's certain things that you won't do. You won't go behind your rules. And then if you're trying to live by Christian standards, you know, it's even more challenging than whatever personal set of rules you have about treating other people. But if you're around somebody that doesn't have any rules, you're incredibly vulnerable. And that's what happens in the movies, is that on both sides of the bars, they have to deal with these two people that aren't playing by any sort of rules. And it makes us incredibly vulnerable. That's one of the reasons we have to use distance. Because if we're not going to respond in kind, then there still has to be some measure of safety. You can't go around being beaten up all the time. I mean, to turn the other cheek, we can talk about that at some point, but it's not to get beat up every day. It's just where you're going to participate in the cycle of violence, and also it actually has more to do with humility and so forth. But the thing is, you don't go looking for that. Who can I be humiliated by today? Or there has to be some measure of safety to be able to kind of survive in the culture. Now the tension's so great with that, it creates a lot of tension that Stephen King can't stick with it, and the bad guys get it in the end. He just can't. He can't quite. He builds up the tension, but he just can't quite have the ending that bad people live in the world. You have to. That part of it is how you're going to live with the fact that some people seem to get away with stuff, though they don't play by the rules and things like that. He has both bad guys get it, so you feel good at the end, pretty much. But there is an incredible vulnerability, and that's why this passage is so important. Forgiveness is not continuing to take the abuse. Forgiveness has to do with how you're going to respond to it, and if the person's not willing to acknowledge what they do and change those behaviors, there is no possibility for reconciliation. And so that's when we have to institute boundaries and so forth to keep the person at a distance. And we're coming to the end of the time, so I want to say talk about one more line. There's a couple things here, but I'll just close with this. So we've just gotten the okay to say, well, there's some people I can't reconcile with, and I'm going to have to keep them at distance. And then Peter comes along and causes trouble like usual. He comes and says, well, Lord, if a brother or sister sins against me, how often should I forgive? 7 times? 7 was a biblical number of perfection. And Jesus says to him, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Which is kind of like affinity, if 7's perfection. So wait a second, you just said I need to kick them out of the community and keep them at a distance, and now I'm supposed to forgive them 70 times 7. And that's why it's so crucial to understand the difference between reconciliation and forgiveness. Forgiveness hopefully leads to reconciliation, but not always. So that person continues to harm me, I've got to keep them at a distance. What needs to happen now? And right after that comes this word about forgiveness. So what's that about? Well, that's about that second experience of sending away the feelings. So let's say you never see this person again. What are you going to do with those feelings? You're going to continue to be hurt and angry and bitter. Every time you think of them, are you going to hope that bad things are happening to them? Is it going to eat away at you? Or are you going to take those feelings and get rid of them no matter what the other person does? Or is it only dependent on what they do? If they do all the right things to help the forgiveness process, is that when I forgive them? Or do I forgive them in all instances, whether they take those steps or not? So we have to ensure the safety and keep the abusive person at the distance, but there's still a forgiveness task, and it's actually harder. That's why the people can say to somebody that's been dead for 30 years, they don't want to let them off the hook, because they haven't gotten the satisfaction of an apology. That person died without ever acknowledging or doing anything about the fact that they hurt me terribly. But there's still important forgiveness work that needs to go on, because that holding on to those feelings, first of all, they don't do anything to the other person. I mean, that's almost a delusion that most people share, because I think we all feel that way. But also those feelings are going to do harmful things to us and to our relationships. We're going to carry them into every relationship. And if somebody pushes that button, out it comes, and our kids are going to sit there and think, why am I getting yelled at? I mean, I know not eating my peas is kind of a bad thing, but why am I getting screamed at? Not eating peas is a 3 on the anger scale. Why am I getting a 10? Well, the other 7 comes from the wounds that haven't been healed, and we're going to dump them on periodically. We're going to dump them on people, and they're going to be baffled, or they're going to be hurt by that, and the cycle continues. And that's one way that we parents often hurt our kids in the way we were hurt, even though we went in determined not to do it. It happened anyway, because we haven't healed those hurts. So even if the abusive person's not apologetic, there's a giant role that forgiveness plays about whether you're going to carry that around for the rest of your life. Are there any final questions or comments? No.
Could you repeat the second half of that definition that you made at the beginning?
Yeah. The first half is to give up the perceived right to get even, and the second is to send away, I'm using the biblical phrase, to send away the feelings of hurt and anger and bitterness. And that's where the inner peace comes. A lot of times the things that Jesus called upon us to do, it makes you seem like a weak person. You know, if you look at it one way, if you get hit and you turn the other cheek, you seem like a weak person. Forgiveness, it seems like, well, you're weak. You really let the person get away with whatever they did with you. But the truth of the matter is, it's the other way around. That it's much harder, much harder to be forgiving than it is to hate. It's much easier to be angry than to let it go. The things that Jesus calls upon us to do, to muster all your courage and go to somebody, whether you're the offender or the offendee, try to work out face to face. All these things take incredible courage, and they are strong. And I'll close with this. One of my favorite scenes from a book and a movie comes from To Kill a Mockingbird. And in the beginning of the story, the son sees his father as kind of a weak person. His father's very mild-mannered. He's probably the only guy in Mississippi who doesn't have a gun. At least at that time, you know, and so he sees his father. His father's too old to play football with the church team. I guess they had children older. So he really sees his father as a weak person. And that changes during the course. You know, of course, his father stands up to the whole town in defending the black man accused of rape. And he finds out his father's the best shot in 3 counties, even though he doesn't have a gun. But there's a scene where after he's kind of humiliated he's shown the whole town that the guy who accused Tom of rape was lying. He and his daughter were lying. Where that guy comes up to him and spits in Gregory Peck's face. And for a second he has the anger, he steps forward, and then he stops himself, and he just pulls out his handkerchief and wipes off the spit and drives away. The son sees this, of course, and even though he didn't respond in kind, there's not anybody there that doesn't know who the stronger person is. And the son kind of sees his father's strength, you know, completely for the first time. That it took a heck of a lot more strength not to sink to the level of the guy who spit in his face, and that walking away is a incredible act of humility and saying, I'm not going to continue this vengeance cycle. Too much has happened. I think he's just gone to tell the wife that his client died trying to escape. But I don't remember that for sure. But you know, so he's got that hurt on top of it. So everybody would understand if he beat the crap out of that other guy. You know, but instead he walks away. And like I said, there isn't anybody there that doesn't know what a strong act that is. Okay. Any final comments? Okay, well, next week we'll talk specifically, we'll get into kind of the details of what the forgiveness process looks like and different things people can do to manage their anger and to send away the bitterness and to reconcile and things like that. Okay? Great. I'll be glad to be here the next couple of weeks to talk about forgiveness. I think it's really central to our faith, but it's also a critical aspect of good relationships. And I really believe that whenever I speak to a group about forgiveness, that a good percentage, if not all of us, have someone in our life that we either need to forgive or be forgiven by, because we don't live in a state of perfect relationships. And that was hit home to me this morning when Julie came in, and I realized it's been quite a while since I've gotten my teeth checked and cleaned, and so I'm in need of forgiveness from her, and I'm hoping to head off the getting yelled at the next time I go, but I don't know if it's going to work or not.
I just give a silent treatment.
Right. There's a story in Guidepost a few years ago that I really liked. It was written by a nurse, and she worked in the ICU, and there was a man there who had had a heart attack, and he was recovering nicely from the heart attack, but she noticed that he was really depressed. And so she began talking to him and found that his only living family member, close family member, was his daughter. And 2 or 3 years before, an adult daughter, 2 or 3 years before, they had a big fight, I think a blow up over the man that she was seeing. And they had not spoken since. So that, at the point they had the heart attack, there had been 2 or 3 or 4 years of silence and no contact. And as he was lying there in his bed, having faced the possibility of dying, all of a sudden things began to look differently to him, and it seemed stupid to have argument like that separate him from the only relative that he had, the daughter that he loved. When the nurse heard this, she got the okay. She called the daughter, who lived in a town a few hours away, and when the daughter found out that her father had a heart attack, was in ICU, she had a similar reaction, that now the argument that had separated them for several years seemed inconsequential. And in the face of her father's possible death, she was now scared about losing him, and so she got into the car and began driving toward to the hospital. But before she arrived, her father had a second, more serious heart attack, and he died. And so he was dead when she arrived at the hospital. But he left her a note, and it's a brief note, and in the note he told her that he loved her and forgave her, and hoped that she would forgive him. And so the daughter found a measure of peace even after the death of her father. But the point is that so many times the things that separate us, the hurts that we get, the fights that we have with other people, it seems worth it at the time to lose that relationship or to alienate ourselves from that person. But in the face of dying, both realized that what they had fought about wasn't worth ruining their relationship over. And that's really at the heart of forgiveness. Is can we repair relationships, because is the relationship worth losing? In this first week, we're going to talk some about the biblical ideas about forgiveness, and then next week we're going to talk about some of the things that people have to overcome and do to be able to forgive well. Dick likes to say if there was only one story from the Bible, he thinks it should be the story of the prodigal son. And in the story is the heart of forgiveness, where the son wastes the father's fortune and then comes back. Says he comes to his senses and he comes back, and to the surprise of his listeners, and sometimes to the anger of listeners now, the son's forgiven and restored as a son. But again, forgiveness gets at the heart of relationships. The father could have accepted the son's bargain, which is, can I come and be a servant? Can I work for you? But to stay angry or to not forgive the son meant losing that relationship, and the father in the story chose, he wanted a son more than he wanted whatever he was entitled to, quote, and getting back at the son for what he had done. Whenever you have questions or comments, just raise your hand, and I'm happy to stop at any point. This morning I want to start, though, with a definition. We need a definition of forgiveness. What is it? And forgiveness, the definition I use is the forgiveness is the giving up the perceived right to get even, and the sending away of feelings of hurt and anger and bitterness. Now the first part's kind of a behavioral thing, and it says it's giving up the perceived right to get even. And I want to highlight the word perceived for a second, because the definition of forgiveness does not acknowledge that getting even is actually a right. We feel like it is. If we've been hurt, we feel like we have the right to hurt back or to do something damaging back. But the definition says that that's a perceived right, that we actually don't have that right for vengeance or to, quote, get even. So it's blocking all those behaviors that would come out really naturally to lash back at another person or hurt them.
That brings up when we talk about that, people keep hollering, they want justice. We have to have justice. Their relative was killed or something, murdered. We have to have justice. Aren't they really saying we want vengeance?
A lot of times they are, and I think, you know, in the end, I think you discover that it's unsatisfying. I once worked with a man after a very serious suicide attempt, and his only son had been killed by a drunk driver shortly after he graduated from high school. And he spent the next year making sure that the drunk driver went to prison, which he did. The suicide attempt came after that, because I believe he discovered, and the driver should have gone to prison. I'm not arguing if something should happen to the driver, but he expected that to feel better after that. And what he discovered was that he didn't. His son was still gone, and whatever term, even if the drunk driver had been given the gas chamber or something, he would have discovered the same thing, that it didn't make up for the loss of his son. So yeah, I think justice and vengeance often get confused, and a lot of our justice system is kind of based on that we'll be satisfied. I remember reading, I like the Mysteries by Tony Hillerman, who writes about the Navajo and some of their practices, and one story was about justice, and it didn't make any sense to the Navajo to send people to prison. And it shows how ingrained your ideas of justice are, because I couldn't wrap my mind around a different way, a really different way of looking at what they perceived as justice. But I think we confuse those things a lot and find out that it isn't that satisfying. It doesn't take away the injury, really, and that's why the getting even is kind of a false concept too, because I'm not sure we ever feel like we get even. You know, somebody really hurts our feelings, we hurt them back. Do we say, okay, we're all square now, I don't have any more feelings about it? And that, I don't think we usually do. I think we're still mad and hurt. They might be mad and hurt now too, but I'm not sure we end up feeling satisfied about that.
Sometimes that starts a cycle where it's back and forth.
Right, and when we get into a little bit about what Jesus said, stopping that cycle of vengeance was actually something that he was very concerned about. And again, nobody looks at things exactly the same way. When they've done studies of couples, they've come to the conclusion that 9 out of 10 times when we hurt or frustrate our spouse, it was not our intention to do that. So let's say I do something and my wife's upset about that, and she calls me a name or something. She might see the score as 1-1, but I see it as 1 unintentional to 1 intentional. You know, so I call her name back. Now we're even in my mind. But no, I've done 2 things, and so she does something, and so I'm not sure we ever have the same scorecard about that either. A couple.